Good evening, everyone. The leadership of John Ruggie and the very hard work of his team and the quality of the inputs from organisations across sectors, many of which are represented here today, have created opportunities at national, regional and international level to make real progress. Amnesty International, other NGOs, civil society organisations will over the next 5 years use public campaigning to generate the political will to put in place the architecture that is needed to close the governance gaps that John Ruggie has referred to in his many reports. Affected communities and human rights defenders will continue to amplify their concerns and to demand remedies for harm done to them. But there's an essential component of progress that has been conspicuous by its absence so far, and that is leadership from both business and government. In this context, it was encouraging to read last month an article in one of India's leading economic journals by the country's Environment Minister, Jairam Ramesh, who said that one of the key development issues in India was whether the country's regulations and laws would be adhered to or whether they'd be disregarded. He pointed out that business believed that it could manipulate the law and that government allowed business to do so. He said that the granting of licenses to companies has become a fait accompli in India. And this wasn't just rhetoric. This was the Environment Minister who set up a panel to investigate the human rights impacts of a proposed mine by a FTSE 100 company, Vedanta Resources, to mine the Niyamgiri Hills in Orissa. And having set up this panel, he then refused the company a license to construct and operate the mine. I think that we need more examples of government ministers who are prepared to stick their heads above the parapet on human rights impacts of business. Wouldn't it be good if within the next 5 years, one of Nigeria's ministers will be drawing attention to the systematic failure of the Nigerian government for half a century to exercise proper oversight over the oil industry in the Niger Delta, an omission which has contributed significantly to the Delta becoming one of the most polluted ecosystems on this planet. Legislatures also have an important role to play in taking action on issues where the executive branch of government is failing to. Chairman referred to the Dodd Bill in the US. I think we should congratulate the Toronto MP, John Mackay, who put forward a private member's bill to tighten federal government scrutiny of Canadian mining operations abroad. The C300 bill, as it's known, fell at its third reading by only a few votes. If successful, it would have created a complaints procedure relating to the impacts of Canadian companies engaged in mining, oil or gas activities in developing countries. There would have been linkage between determination of the complaint and the granting of export credit guarantees, with a denial of financial support to companies found to be in breach of the standards set out in this Act of Parliament. There would have been linkages with the trade promotion work of Canada's Foreign Affairs Department, and also with investments by Canada's State Pension Fund. These are the kind of initiatives that we would like to see more of during the next 5 years. Such legislation would create linkages between the two pillars of Ruggie's framework through the imposition of sanctions on those companies that fail to conduct human rights due diligence. Another area where there's a pressing need for leadership is within the investment community. Fund managers' engagement with companies that they invest in on human rights issues is often ineffective, as Amnesty International learned during a series of meetings that we had with investors to discuss their engagement with Vedanta resources. This is something that needs to be changed. Fund managers that promote their products as socially responsible, and many, many mainstream fund managers have socially responsible funds and portfolios. They're likely to come under growing scrutiny over the next 5 years, not just from civil society organisations, but we hope from their own clients, particularly pension funds that most of us here contribute to. One factor that is likely to make human rights material to investors in future is the rise in civil litigation from victims, often taken against parent companies. And here I beg to differ with Michael about the usefulness of the Alien Tort Claims Act. These kind of actions are very important because they create risk for companies, and through the creation of risk, companies can be expected to change their behaviour. There's at the moment an ongoing suit against a UK-registered mining company, Monterico Metals, for complicity in the torture of protesters who are demonstrating against the environmental impacts of the company's mine in Peru. Last week, a class action suit was filed in Canada by relatives of victims and survivors of a massacre in the Democratic Republic of Congo against the Canadian mining company Anvil. More than 70 civilians were allegedly killed by Congolese troops when they recaptured the town of Kilwa in 2004. Anvil Mining is accused of providing logistical support to the military. The fact that the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre now has a portal dedicated to legal cases against companies is a reflection of the growing interest and relevance of such action and the risks that such action poses to companies. Over the next 5 years, we're likely to see a growing focus on Indigenous peoples. In the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in view of the growing encroachment of business activities on their lands across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, to the detriment of their cultures, their livelihoods, and their health in many cases. And also, we're seeing attempts by governments to criminalise and delegitimise them. Free, prior, and informed consent is a demand that is likely in future to be central on the agenda of the human rights community with regard to Indigenous groups. Just to wind up, not to wind you up, although I may do that later, while the field of business and human rights has developed considerably over the last 5 years at a normative level and will continue to develop, it will require more leadership from business and from governments to operationalise these norms in a way that will close the governance gaps that John Ruggie has referred to. Thank you.